went through the great Lenten period, and God allowed us to see the resurrection of the Lord this year. And may that also happen again for the next year. The reading that we read just now shows the Lord coming to meet his apostles at various times. And one can ask the question, well, after the resurrection, why didn't he not just ascend to heaven and, having finished his work, be back in the heavenly realm from whence he came? There are many answers to that. Quite obviously, he has not finished his work yet. Of course, one of the reasons that he did not ascend at that point, but waited another 40 days, was to show to the people that he indeed had resurrected and was alive, as we just read with respect to Apostle Thomas, who had the nerve to say that I won't believe until I see the wounds that the Lord has acquired. The other apostles too were not nervy enough to ask that question, but had those doubts themselves. But he was the one that stood out and proved that indeed the Lord was the one who had been crucified and resurrected from the dead. He of course appeared to others during this 40-day period before his ascension to complete his work. What work? What work did he have to do? This is where Orthodoxy separates itself from every other so-called Christian confession, because these 40 days of the Lord's period between his resurrection and ascension into heaven form one of the most fundamental parts about our beliefs and our dogmas. You have to realize that these apostles, most of them were very simple people, fishermen and tent makers and all these sorts of things. And they didn't have all the knowledge that was required of them to be sent out into the world as apostles. So they had to go through a heck of a lot of training, a heck of a lot of understanding. And this occurred during this period. I like to call it the boot camp of the apostles. You know, boot camp, how soldiers are taken on a couple of months of training before they're sent to war. And they're given this very difficult period of exercising and learning to use weapons and all these sort of things. This is what Christ took his apostles through. Therefore, by the time Pentecost came, when the church was given, you have to realize the church has not been given yet. Everything was in place. They knew exactly how to serve. They knew about the vestments, the iconography, how the church is to be organized and run, the sort of various embellishments that were allowed, the spiritual life. Because don't forget, these are going to be the key people that are going out into the world, all over the nations, and are going to be preaching the resurrection. And they're going to be meeting with very intelligent others who are going to put them to task with various questions about this new faith of Christianity. So during this 40-day period, they had to go through all of this. And people say, show us in the Gospels where this is written. Well, it is. It is. St. John, in his writings, writes that Christ did so much during this period that all the books in the world can't contain them. Just think about that. Can't contain them. We, of course, embrace most of that in Holy Tradition and in the services of the church, which are a direct reflection. The Gospels and the Bible being basically a summary of it, and not all the details there, because it's just impossible. You have volumes and volumes and volumes. I mean, already we have about 40 kilograms of books just to go through a year's services. That's a lot of books, you know. That's a lot of books. And so the apostles had to be taken through this, to be educated and to understand theology, the services, spiritual life, and all those sorts of things. So that was another reason. And here is another reason which we just read today. The Lord says, He breathed on them and said, receive ye the Holy Spirit. If you give the sins of any, they are forgiven. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained. So He is already giving them the right of the bishopric, of the priesthood. He is giving them the grace to be able to perform these sacraments. All of them, except one. And that one was Peter, who thrice denied Him. Not just dodged, but actually denied Christ and had to be reconciled. He did not receive that grace at this point. But another week or so after, when they were fishing, Christ came to the shore and saw them out in the boat, catching nothing. So He created some fish for breakfast. God can do that, create fish. Where did He get the fish? And He was cooking them for them. They came to shore, recognized Him, and Peter came forward. And before all those witnesses, the other apostles, Christ took Peter to task, nicely. He said, do you love me? Peter said, yes. I'm going to feed my sheep. Do you love me? 3 times. Because he denied Him thrice, Peter had to be reinstalled with thrice a confession. Before witnesses, before the others, because had they not witnessed it, they may not have believed Peter. Peter said, I've been reconciled as one of the apostles. They said, well, we didn't see that. How do we know you're not telling a fib or something like that? And they stood around there carefully listening to what was going on between Peter and the Lord. After Peter had repented and pledged his loyalty again to the Lord, he got the same grace that these were given the first week. To bind, to loose, to teach, to look after the flock, to go out into the world and preach and do all the others. The others were listening. They'd already know this, but they were sort of getting a second dose of it so that everybody understood what the duty of a bishop is going to be and a priest, whatever. It's too bad that many take that passage, totally ignoring what we have just now read, and consider that Peter was given some sort of special grace to become the head of all the church. In other words, to take Christ's position. They call it a vicar or something. Not so. We have already here where Peter did not get that grace, but the apostles did a week before, the grace of all that was necessary. Because all the apostles were equally the same with the grace that had been given to them. Yes, there is this concept that we call first amongst equals. First amongst equals. It's a title of filial love, where we have somebody who we respect on account of their knowledge and good nature and leadership, and we consider them to be somebody that we look up to. In our days, of course, patriarchs, metropolitans, bishops, those sorts of characters, abbots, spiritual fathers, God-bearing elders and eldresses. First amongst equal, but it doesn't mean that they are the authority of the church. That doesn't mean that they command the church to do all these sorts of things. Not at all. First amongst equals is such an important part in this. Puts to flight all these claims that St. Peter somehow is the one that built the church and established it and did all these sorts of things, which we know he did not, because all the other apostles did the same. They travelled around all the world proclaiming this good message of salvation. These 40 days, they were ready then for what Christ promised them, the coming of the church, which occurs in Pentecost, Penta 5:58. day, which we, God willing, will celebrate when the church is given from the heavenly realm onto the earthly one, so that it can proclaim all those things that Christ taught and did, because it's all contained within that church and within this holy tradition. Another one that's often neglected is the Mother of God. All this time she is with them. All this time she knows about them. She's under the care of Apostle John. She goes out into the missionary field with them. She tells them those secrets that she kept in her heart when Christ was with us, and filled in all these gaps about his life and about the spiritual life that she'd acquired. And that's neglected. Well, it's neglected in the Bible because, as I said to you last week, a mother's witness is not counted very much, but it's not neglected in our services nor in holy tradition. She gave a lot of material for us to understand the dogmas of the church and how it all operates. So for these reasons, the Lord had not yet finished his work on earth, but had all these things to contend with, prepare them for the church, so that when it came, everything was ready. It was, like they say in management talk, hit the road running. The rubber hits the road running. There was none of this development. You know, we have all these so-called theologians that say that our Christianity developed. No, it didn't develop. Everything was in place. There were embellishments, of course. And last year we saw how these embellishments have to disappear so that we can dodge all the machinations of politics that try to stop the church. But there is no actual development because the truth is given, and we know the truth, and there's nothing to develop. When wrong ideas arise, wrong teachings, heresies, the church steps forward and clarifies these things, but it doesn't develop anything. And we find our clarifications in the 7 ecumenical councils, which essentially focus on all the heresies, particularly those which have wrong understanding of who Christ is. And if ever you find yourself confused about something like that, read them, because they go through it in great detail one by one. And the Holy Fathers say that there is no need for any more ecumenical councils, because everything that we now have has been captured there one way or another. And if there is another movement for an 8th one, be assured that that is something anti-Christian. So don't fall for that, because most of the people that want this 8th council are focusing on politics and not on spiritual life, not on salvation. And that's important for us to know. So during this period, a joyful period, we are all celebrating this resurrection for the 40 days, and then for another 10 days to bring us to the Pentecost period. The service books we use at the moment, the Pentecostarian big thick service book, replaces the Lenten Triodian that we used during the Lenten period. It shows you the richness of our faith. And of course, one book is not enough. Like I said, 40 kilograms you need for the year's need of all the services that we have. What else? This week on Tuesday, the church celebrates or commemorates the reposed, and it's traditional for priests and people to go to cemeteries and to do part of the resurrection service there. We will try on the afternoon of Tuesday to go first to Faulkner, and then perhaps to Springvale, where a lot of our friends are also buried there. So if you have any particular requirements in that respect, it would be good to come and help us with the singing a little bit, and with the commemoration of those who now rest in the graves waiting for the resurrection. And by the way, from today's reading, we see that Christ appears in the midst of his apostles without knocking on the door or anything, just appears, goes through the walls or whatever, showing us now his true body that everybody will resurrect with. Everybody will resurrect with that sort of body, both the good and the unrighteous. The good for the kingdom of heaven, and the unrighteous for the judgment upon them into the demonic realm. And therefore, there is no difference except that those who do not get into the kingdom of heaven through the great judgment, that sort of body will only cause suffering to them. But it's not the same fallen nature that Christ was born with that allowed him to suffer as he did during the passion and during his life. That is so important for us to understand, that Christ was fully man, let's repeat to you again, fully God, and now indeed after his resurrection he shows that in truth. The miracles that come forward, all this new teaching, the establishment of the church, and all the sort of things that we need for our salvation. God help us to understand these things